I think David touched on, in his talk, he touched on something important. What's the point of government? And that is simply to protect recognize our rights, protect that, and enforce our contracts. Now, the ANC certainly wasn't qualified to change the terms of that social contract just because it had an ideological shift. People with far more insights into the nature of humanity applied their minds to this issue and came to this formula about what is it that we as individuals give up to government to drive development, and that is the Lockean kind of social contract. Dr. De Jager and Dr. Jeffrey went into a lot of detail about how that social contract is being violated in South Africa, and I fear that even maybe in our circles, certainly in our extended circles, big business, we still operate under this assumption that we are dealing with good faith actors in government. That is simply not the case. This is an unequal partnership where we are talking to them as if we are trying to convince the ANC of the righteousness of private property, of free markets, of respect for the rule of law. Am I back? Cool. The ANC doesn't care. The EFF wouldn't care. Many other political parties operating in South Africa would not care. And I think we would be better off if we stopped engaging with them as if they cared. We are wasting our time. What we need to do, unfortunately, is a very serious and a strict kind of mental shift away from effectively meekly pleading with the state to please not whip us anymore, and shift into what David and Sarah this week at a different talk called negotiating. The private sector in South Africa, which would include civil society, certainly big business, we need to draw a line in the sand and say we're done pleading, we're done trying to convince you, you are out to hurt us. And we're done playing this game. And the way we know this is free expropriation bill. Expropriation without compensation, to the lawyers in the room, they would know this is a contradiction in terms. There is no such thing as expropriation without compensation. Expropriation is confiscation plus compensation. If you take away the compensation, you're left with confiscation, which is a tool of punishment. We see that in criminal law with asset forfeiture. If you've done something wrong, the government comes and it takes your property from you and it pays you nothing because you have done something wrong for which you have invited social punishment. Now, this government is trying to do that with an ancient legal institution known as expropriation, and it's not on. If the government thinks that farmers have done something wrong, it needs to go to criminal court and prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they have committed a criminal wrong, and on that basis forfeit their property. But of course they don't want to do that because this government is working with an ideological imperative. It does not care about interests and property and liberty, etc. The other thing is custodianship. We've now, Dr. Jeffrey spoke in detail about how custodianship has been implemented in South Africa and how the government may bring it back in the future. But let's use the real word for it. It's nationalization. This is textbook socialist conduct that is addressed in nice-sounding legal garb that, unfortunately, I'm a jurist, I'm a legal academic, and it's my colleagues, my legal academic fraternity that has provided the government with this tripe, this nonsensical notion of custodianship being somehow distinct from nationalization in the old communist sense. And we've done the same thing with this idea of no compensation. No. The government isn't going to take your property without compensation. It is going to pay you compensation, but to the amount of nil, 0 rand, that is what you receive in exchange for your property. And I've had conversations with professors like Almin du Plessis and these individuals who are sincere. They look at me without any type of irony and anything. They're like, yes, Martin, of course, it's 0 rand compensation. There you go. There you have been paid compensation. And I feel like I want to pull the little hair I have left that I'm hiding under my hat out when this conversation is had, because this is not how constitutional democracy works, ladies and gentlemen. We are working with a government supported by an intelligentsia that is a bad faith actor. We need to start treating it that way. We are not partners of this government. This government is a hostile entity, and we need to be very aware that future governments may act the same. We need to organize, we need to make that mental shift, and we need to start gathering the confidence to say that very important word that civil society and a democracy is always unwilling to say, and that is no.
Is there some more comment? Yes.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce what Dr. de Jager just said. So probably the two most important books that anyone can read on understanding really in substance what is happening in South Africa today is to first read Dr. Jeffrey's Countdown to Socialism, and immediately thereafter to read Dr. Koos Malan's There Is No Supreme Constitution. Now, I am a constitutionalist. I believe very firmly in a written supreme constitution with strong protections for individual rights, but sometimes, maybe not that often, circumstances align to such an extent that all three your branches of government, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, become ideologically aligned with one another to be quite against the constitutional setup that you would want. And unfortunately in South Africa we've seen that where most of our courts, especially the highest court, the Constitutional Court, has fallen in with the ideological alignment of the NDR kind of cabal. So as far as I'm concerned, checks and balances at that level, don't put your faith in it. But as Dr. de Jager says, civil society is, in fact, and people don't think about it in this way, is in fact another check and balance on the power of government. And not just civil society, but also commerce. From your smallest business all the way up to your biggest business, these are concentrations of power. I would follow the business group Sakeliga very closely on this. They're very good on this topic. Where business has a constitutional role to play as a check and a balance upon the power of government. And if I can give any advice to the person who asked the question about checks and balances and them failing, and to South Africans more broadly, invest in your local communities. I know there's the kind of the bad aspect of it is that could become a warlordism thing, and that's a risk. But I think South Africans are probably, on the whole, we're a bit more soberly minded than that. And I think we can root out the warlords before they come about and establish real coherent and reasonable community structures to protect us against the state. And we saw this in July 2021 in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng when the riots happened and the police and the army cowered in their bases and in their police stations, when communities came out and protected each other. And I can promise you they broke a hell of a lot of laws doing that. But that's okay. That's fine under those circumstances. And we need to invest and ensure that our communities can do that and are ready to do that, and our businesses are ready to do that when the time comes, when the government finally steps over that line and really adopts these totalitarian laws that Davi also alluded to, that we're on the way to.
So we're coming to the tying up moment of the conversation. Can we maybe go down from the far end of the stage? If you would just do a brief summarizing statement, perhaps from your perspective, what is the biggest single threat to individual property rights in South Africa at the moment?
Okay, we are the single biggest threat, because we, and I say that as the South African population, are succumbing to defeatism and despondency, and that is the single biggest threat to any type of prosperity and freedom anywhere in the world. It's not the government. The government can only do what we ultimately allow it to. It's not nefarious corporate interests. They can also ultimately only do what the market allows it to. So we are the biggest threat. And the way I like to kind of end things on a positive note is to say that we kind of tie ourselves up in this idea that, geez, we have this radical idea of freedom and private property rights and liberty, and we have to convince everyone that this is the right way forward, and that's just impossible because take your pick of the various excuses, people are uneducated, people are disinterested, whatever. That's not the case. The reality is that substantive reform in any society takes only about 2.5% of the population. A very active, diligent, and dedicated minority is all you need to attain the outcomes that you want for your society. You do not have to set a mountain for yourself to overcome to see the change that you want in the world. We do not have to convince all the ANC's voters. We do not have to convince all the EFF's voters. We have a far more doable task, and that is to convince a relatively small-ish group, not necessarily the whole elite, but a part of the influencing elite in South Africa and around the world. We need to convince them that strong and secure private property rights are the necessary aspect to a prosperous society and a flourishing society. Freedom is always within grasp. I always like to think about the post-communist world. I mean, Ukraine was destroyed by the Holodomor. You had Vietnam, which had a hugely destructive war, and followed by, of course, a communist regime. But within a generation, thereabouts, these became some of the most prosperous societies in the world. Look at Japan, look at Germany. Some of the most prosperous societies in the world after total devastation. It's very possible. There is no such thing as the point of no return. It doesn't exist. There's always a point of return. We, as South Africans, just need to take the conscious decision that, hey, we actually want a better life, and we've now properly identified what that better life is. So we just need to understand, we just need to show that small influencing elite. We need to secure private property rights. And then, yeah, even if the ANC and the EFF form a coalition and they nationalize the Reserve Bank and they nationalize all land and we have a few years of famine, yes, it can get worse. But it can get very good very quickly if we just make that decision to go there. So we are the biggest threat to private property rights if we do not have a very, very modest mindset shift.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Excellent answer. Mr. Root, pressure's on you.
Yeah, I agree with what he said. Yeah, I can only add that I'm not too concerned. I'm not too concerned is because two reasons. The one is that the good thing about having an incompetent government is they can also not implement bad ideas. And the second thing is that there are so dramatic technological changes taking place, and it's becoming more and more difficult to really push us into corners. And our responsibility, I agree with you, is to do whatever we can to influence everybody, to teach people about the importance of private property rights.
Dr. de Jager?
I think our biggest threat is the possibility of sinking into the quicksand of political correctness and losing our will and ability to say no.
Short and hard. Yes. Finally, Dr. Jeffries.
Not sure how can I possibly top any of these points, or even contribute something else. But I really, just picking up on the idea that we are the problem, there are certain organizations too, entities that have influence in society. I think media and other commentators are not doing enough to warn against the risks that we face. I think business, as we've talked about, is often too quick to try and partner with government and make transformation work, instead of doing that, drawing that line in the sand and saying no and fighting back harder. So let us try to influence the constituent, the important influencing groups that can have a big impact on how people see the threats and how they see the opportunities which are also there.
Thank you. I'm going to take the opportunity of having the mic to also say, I think that in terms of the modus operandi of the government, whenever a big target for opposition is placed, people they get together, right? They say that we had to remove Jacob Zuma. You know, if it's a big target, it's easy. And as a consequence, the modus operandi of the government is many cuts, many directions, many different, and that's exhausting. You know, it's the way that, the wild dogs take down a buffalo. Many, many, many. And so perhaps it's a question of saying at some point from a principled stand to say we draw the line because it is impossible to keep track of all the different threats that are taking place. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciated the energy in this panel.